With huge pressure coming from the United States for Europe and Canada to take much more responsibility at NATO, in particular when it comes to Ukraine, for the Europe conversation, I catch up with Dutch Defence Minister Ruben Brekelmans. He tells me that the United States will no longer chair the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, and also how the Netherlands will have to have some serious conversations about increasing their spending on defence. Ruben Brekelmans, Minister for Defence for the Netherlands, thank you very much for joining us on the Europe conversation.
Thank you.
Now, we're here at NATO for the Ukraine Defence Contact Group meeting. This was always chaired exclusively by the United States, but now it's been chaired by the UK and Germany. Has the US permanently walked off the pitch when it comes to this? Is it going to be consistently only European-led? Because that is a symbolic as well as a practical change.
It has been taken over, the chairmanship has been taken over by Germany and the UK. I think it's very important that we all decided to continue the UDCG, the Ramstein Group, a cooperation of more than 50 countries to support Ukraine. I think it's also important that the United States remains involved. So today, virtually, Pete Hegseth, the American Secretary of Defense, was also joining and also sharing how the United States is keeps supporting Ukraine.
But you're not concerned that the US is no longer chairing that?
The United States has clearly stated also today that they remain committed in their support to Ukraine, that they keep delivering what they promised. I think that's the most important thing, and I think it's good that two of the leading nations, the UK and Germany, have taken over this leading role also when it comes to the UDCG.
And yet Steve Witkoff, the United States envoy or negotiator, is in the Kremlin today while Pete Hegseth was online. We also see the US putting much more pressure on the Ukraine when it comes to concessions during these peace negotiations. What's your own interpretation of this setup?
We see a lot more reluctance from the Russian side to compromise and to talk seriously. So I think it is good that also more pressure is put on Russia because they need to compromise to a larger extent, I would say, but they need to compromise much more than they are currently doing. I think what's also very important is that we continue the support to Ukraine and that we step up our efforts. I was in Dnipro myself 10 days ago. I saw, it was the morning after a big air attack. I saw the impact with my own eyes. Also spoke to some of the generals there who are leading the Easter group of the Ukrainian forces. And they were telling us that the fighting is more intense than ever. And that Ukraine needs more and more support in order to be able to hold the line. And I think we need to do that because not only it's saving Ukrainian lives, but also if the position at the battlefield becomes stronger, then also the position of Ukraine becomes stronger at the negotiation table. And if the outlook for Ukraine improves and of Russia deteriorates, then of course Russia would also be pressured more to compromise. And I think that's important.
Do you think any pressure has been put on Russia so far, though?
It's hard for me to say because I'm not sitting there at the negotiation table. I don't know what the Americans are telling Russia exactly. I think it's very important that we keep the sanctions in place, that we also expand the number of sanctions, but also strengthen the functioning of the sanctions, because we now see that those sanctions are circumvented. So we should do much more also on this to make sure that those sanctions are more effective. But of course, there are more ways in which pressure could be put on Russia. I'm always in favor of that. For example, also looking at opportunities to use the Russian frozen assets to support Ukraine more, because that would put both pressure on Russia and also help to support Ukraine.
Do you think Belgium or other countries are any closer to agreeing to that?
Of course, there are some legal hesitations. There are also some other considerations. I think it is important that we keep looking creatively at opportunities in order to use those frozen assets. As I said, it is important because we need this continuous flow of military support to Ukraine. Because
obviously the Netherlands has been a huge supporter of Ukraine with F-16s from a humanitarian perspective, from a legal perspective in terms of investigations into international humanitarian law breaches. But looking at your own government, there is a bit of a split. There was a €3.5 billion discussion within the government, within the parliament, and one of your political partners, Geert Wilders, was against supplying more money to Ukraine. Can you tell us a little bit about the situation that you find yourselves now in as a Dutch government with somebody, a senior partner, really against supporting Ukraine, and how will that fare in the long term?
So we, of course, in the Netherlands, we have a coalition with 4 parties, and we created a coalition agreement. It took quite a long time in order to get there. But what we agreed upon is very clear, that our support to Ukraine is unwavering in any dimension, also in the military support. So over the last few years, our support has been 3.5 billion on average. And that's why we also decided that we will spend another 3.5 billion next year, and that we will accelerate and front-load that support so that we can already spend 2 billion of this year.
Will the Netherlands have to maybe take money from elsewhere, other social services, health, education, housing and so on, to continue to pay for this, particularly at a time of such global instability when it comes to economics and finances throughout the world?
If we want to spend increase our defense budget to a large extent, so of course there's now a discussion about increasing the NATO goal, and it's about serious numbers. So in the Netherlands we are around 2% now. That's what's in our budget. And if we grow to a much larger percentage, of course, agreeing on that in itself is not the difficult part, but how to fund that, how to finance that. And that will require political decisions that are difficult. There are 3 options in theory. You either raise taxes, you cut spending, or you raise your debt level. And those are all 3 are difficult political discussions. We are having some of those discussions now in the Netherlands, but that's only for next year. For us, an important moment is going to be the NATO summit in The Hague, in our country, for the first time in history. With the 32 countries, we need to agree upon a new NATO defense investment pledge, a new percentage.
What would you think is the best option? Do you think that maybe this financial mechanism within the coalition of the willing might be something that the Netherlands could borrow off, or do you think the money should come from taxes? Because obviously the Americans are saying 5%. Maybe it'll come down to 3.54%, but it's still more than double what you're paying already. What would your preference be?
So I think it is important that in every country, whether it's any NATO member, NATO ally, or any EU member, every country needs to have this political discussion. So if we want to increase our defense spending, what type of political choices need to be made in order to fund that? And that's not easy for any of us, but we all need to have these national discussions, also in the Netherlands. And for me, it's hard to predict what comes out of it. And of course, there are EU instruments that can support in this. But the lion's share of this should take place on a national level.
Do we know any more in relation to this potential reassurance force or peacekeeping force or whatever that might look like after your meetings with the coalition of the willing? Obviously, I know the Netherlands would be involved in it in some way, but do we know what it might look like and whether Europe could be there for a backstop to support Ukraine with the absence of the United States?
Yeah, so I think the military planning has taken place over the last few weeks, so it's now becoming more clear how a potential European involvement can look like. But what we do still see is that, you know, the coalition of the willing consists of around 30 countries, and different countries still have different interpretations on how such a military engagement should look like, what the objective is, what the mandate should be. How it would relate to a potential monitoring mission, which is something separate, but should take place at the front line.
Could it happen without the security guarantees of the United States? Could Europe and the coalition of the willing, and other countries, stand in for Ukraine in a way that Ukraine has been failed for so many times?
We need to have the United States on board in the sense that they are playing a central role now in the negotiations. They are playing a key role when it comes to European security, and also, of course, when it comes to the support of Ukraine. So they need to be on board in some way. I think what we should do now is make sure that we have a clear plan, that European countries can also say, okay, this is what we can bring to the table, and then specifically have the conversation with the United States on what their role is going to be. But it's too early still to say more details about this, because there are still many different ways in which the United States can be involved.
The Netherlands is trying to boost its military or expand its military, and you sent out this questionnaire to 18 to 27-year-olds. What are you trying to achieve by sending out a questionnaire to young people about potentially joining the military? What would be the objective here?
The objective would be to have people think about whether they would be interested to join the military, or whether they would do as we call it, a service year. So it's a 1 year in which young people can get to know our military. And after that 1 year, they can decide whether they want to join, or whether they want to become a reservist, or whether they want to do something else. All options are still open. We don't want to have any subscription. That's not what we are going to do. We want to keep it voluntary. But this is a way to have young people think about, whether defense and whether the military would be something for them.
But it's a seismic moment, isn't it, that you're doing that?
So we need to grow in terms of budget. Of course, we are growing, but we also need to grow in terms of the material that we procure, but also in the number of people. We have currently around 75,000 people working for our Ministry for Defense. We need to grow towards 100,000. And on top of that, we want to have much more flexibility. So we need up to another 100,000 more, mostly reservists, to make sure that if tensions arise, that we will be able to mobilize more people in order to support our military.
Do we know much about America's plans to potentially reduce the troop size in Europe from 100,000 to potentially 50,000 or somewhere in between?
So far, they haven't announced any reduction. The US is committed to NATO. Also, when it comes to Article 5, they very clearly state that. But they also said that Europe should do much more, that it's not about burden sharing anymore, but about burden shifting. And what I see is a great willingness among European countries, including the Netherlands, to step up our efforts. And if then the United States over time decides to reallocate some of its resources to their own region, for their homeland defense, or to the Indo-Pacific or anywhere else, I think the most important thing is that we do this together and that we create a shared plan in which they are able maybe to shift some of their resources to other parts of the world, and we as European countries can gradually take over some of those resources. But we need to keep the United States on board. They will remain essential to our security. But I think it's also in the interest of the United States to keep NATO strong, and that's also what they always state.
Okay, well, Ruben Brekelmans, Minister of Defence for the Netherlands, thank you very much for joining us on the Europe Conversation.
You're welcome.